All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Aubrey. I'm a forest ecologist at University of Georgia Savannah River Ecology Lab and Warnell School of Forestry. My co-author, Joe O'Brien, is a research fire ecologist with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station, located at Athens at the Center for Forest Disturbance Science. So, Mike Davis said that there'd never really been a talk at this meeting on prescribed fire and loblolly pine. And so Joe and I talked a little bit about it, and we realized that despite all of the loblolly that's burned annually on public lands, there's a lot of foresters, typically those who aren't involved in prescribed fire, that don't really look at loblolly as a fire pine. And so we thought it might be good to just kind of ask this question, is loblolly a fire pine? So to try to address that kind of overarching question, I'm going to go through a couple of different things. First, we're going to talk about what is a fire pine, right? You guys all probably have a certain species in mind right now as we're talking about that. As we do that, we're going to talk about the different traits, right? So in the family Pinaceae, the pine family, what are the different fire-adapted traits? And we're going to put that into context of life history, right? So different developmental stages, juveniles versus adults. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the evolutionary history of when those traits developed. Did they develop at a time when fire was occurring? Did they develop in response to fire as an adaptation, or do they just happen to be adaptive to fire? Another thing I guess it's important to understand, well, why do we care about loblolly? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then why do we burn loblolly? So we'll spend plenty of time discussing that. And then we're going to finally kind of end on this idea of, what are the research questions that we still need to know, right? If you're not convinced that loblolly is a fire pine by the end of this, what are the other research questions that we need to address in order to convince you? Okay, so I said you guys all probably had something in mind when I said a fire pine. And this is what typically comes to mind. We saw the video earlier that had a lot of people burning in longleaf stands. So, the pamphlet in the center here, the pine that fire built, was put out by the Longleaf Alliance. Georgia Wildlife put out that the magazine on the right, The Fire Forest. So longleaf is really considered to be the fire pine in the southeast. And a lot of that is because of its juvenile life history. So looking at the diagram on the left, you see at the bottom there's the grass stage, right? So that's a unique adaptation in the pine family that only a few pine species have that makes it very tolerant of fire. And not just tolerant, but it thrives in fire. So I think it's pretty easy for us to say that longleaf is a fire pine, right? And so that's kind of the one that we compare everything else to. So what about slash? Is slash a fire pine? Well, this is kind of a little bit of a tough one because there's really two different slash pines out there. So the common slash pine I'll get back to here after I say something about loblolly because it's very similar to loblolly in a lot of respects. The South Florida slash is a little bit more like longleaf. So it doesn't have a grass stage in the strict sense, but it does have this kind of pseudo grass stage. And you can see that in the image to the right there, kind of emerging from that grass stage. Okay, so what about shortleaf, right? So we've got, so there's 4 pine species we're going to go through here that are all commercially important in the southeast. So longleaf, slash, shortleaf, and then we're going to get to loblolly in a second. So shortleaf doesn't have the grass stage like longleaf, and it doesn't have that pseudo-grass stage like South Florida slash. But you can see in this picture a very unique fire-adapted trait that we usually associate with hardwoods, right? And that's this resprouting capability. So what about loblolly? So loblolly doesn't have a grass stage like longleaf, doesn't have a pseudo-grass stage like slash, and it doesn't have the resprouting capacity of shortleaf. But what it does have is really thick bark. right? And all 4 of these pines have really thick bark when they're mature. So loblolly doesn't have any fire-adapted traits that it exhibits as a juvenile, but once it gets to be mature, it is very fire tolerant. So we do need to kind of consider it a fire pine at that stage. So let's kind of go through these 5 big fire-adapted traits in pine. These are serotiny, branch shedding or self-pruning, bark thickness, the presence of a grass stage, and the capacity to resprout. I'll go through each one of these and describe them a little bit more. So serotiny, that's not one that I discussed with any of these pines so far, right? So none of our 4 commercially important southern pines exhibit serotiny. But this, so lodgepole pine in the northwest is a good example of this. Serotiny is when the cone does not open and release seeds until there is a heat treatment to it, right? So, and this usually is associated with a canopy fire regime. So on the left here is an image of a lodgepole pine cone, and you can see that it's kind of sitting on a mineral soil. It's a little bit charred, and it's open, so it's released its seeds. On the right is also a lodgepole pine cone in the closed position, and then one in the open position. So serotiny is our first fire-adapted trait. The second one is branch shedding or self-pruning, and all of our southern pines exhibit self-pruning. So the example over here on the left is a longleaf, and so this is actually one of our state record longleafs down in Thomasville, Georgia, the Greenwood plantation. You can barely look down on the left side of that tree, and there's one of my students standing next to it. But you go up almost halfway up that tree, and there's no dead branches. There's no branches to create a ladder of fuel to go from the surface up to the canopy. To contrast that, we've got a picture of lodgepole on the right side there. And so lodgepole retains a lot of those lower branches right after they die and provides that ladder to go back up. And that's really indicative of a canopy surface regime, or a canopy fire regime as opposed to a surface fire regime. Okay, thick bark. So, like I said, all of our pines have thick bark. And as a matter of fact, they all have really thick bark. When mature, the bark is always thicker than about 1 inch in diameter. So why is the thickness of bark important? If you look at the bottom left, I've got just that basic anatomy of a tree stem, right? So, think in order to maintain physiological functions, we need to protect the cambial cells from heat, right? So the number out there in the literature is about 60 degrees Celsius. If you heat those cells up beyond 60 degrees C, they're going to die. So those cambium cells are really important. They're kind of like stem cells, right? They create the sapwood that moves water towards the inside of the cambium, and they create the phloem cells that move all of the sugars through the plant towards the outside. So that bark is really critical to protect them, insulate them. On the top left is a picture of a couple of longleaf cross sections, and there's 2 things that I want you to think about there. The cross section on the left is about 8 inches in diameter there, and you can see that there's quite a bit of variation as you go around the circumference of that tree in terms of the bark thickness, right? On the left side, you can see it's really, really thick, and then if you look at like that 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock position, it's thinner, obviously thinner. Not thin, but thinner than where it is on the really thick side. And then to the right of that shows you a smaller diameter, and the bark thickness there is proportionally thinner, right? Still thick, but not as thick as the large stem diameter. So we see that pattern. The picture on the right is a 4.5-foot diameter loblolly, so a pretty big loblolly, and you can see that the bark thickness is pretty large. We have any golfers in the house? Anybody know the Eisenhower tree that I have here? Okay, so this Eisenhower tree was on I think the left side of the 17th hole at Augusta National. So I live in Augusta, and this place is right next door. And so I think in 1948, Eisenhower, so about 4 years before he was president, joined the club, And he hit this tree all the time, to the point that he tried to get that golf club to remove it, right? He petitioned for the cutting this tree down. The club did not do that, and so it forever became known as the Eisenhower tree. And so in 2014, it actually died, and so this is a cross-section of it. But again, so the point is really thick bark on all of these species. And so the definitions in the literature for thick bark is 15 millimeters. Really thick bark, 30 millimeters, right? And so an inch is, what, 25 and a half millimeters? So we're really looking at just larger than an inch for really thick bark. And really thick bark insulates this cambium from really intense surface fires. Okay, so the presence of the grass stage, right? So this is a really interesting juvenile life history stage, that there's only 10 pine species in the world that exhibit this true grass stage. On the left is longleaf, right? So I think we're all familiar with that one. This one is just one from behind my office I took one day. And so the grass stage, if you're not really familiar, it's where the seedling spends somewhere between 2 and 15 years, or what the literature suggests for longleaf, as kind of looking like a bunch grass. It's not really growing up, it's not growing branches, but it is photosynthesizing, and the way that those needles are arranged, they protect that apical bud from the thermal energy of fire, right? And so these grasses, they get scorched during fires. A lot of you have seen that. They rebuild that tissue, and at some point they bolt up and become saplings, or rockets and then saplings. On the right is a pine from Cuba, western Cuba. This is Pinus tropicalis. So this is another one of those 10 that exhibits that grass stage, right? If you just looked at that, not knowing that was a Pinus tropicalis, you might think that that's a longleaf growing in the grass stage. Okay, so the last one is this resprouting capacity, right? So again, we usually think about hardwoods, right? This is a trait that a lot of hardwoods have developed, and it's one of the things that keeps us returning fire to places to try to keep them from getting beyond that resprouting stage and into the mid-story. So that's shortleaf again on the left, and then you go all the way over off the coast of the Saharan Desert, and you run into the Canary Island pine in the Canary Islands. And so what's interesting about the Canary Island pine is it's not just resprouting down from below, it can also resprout on the stem. So there's about 16 different pine species that resprout. So again, resprouting and grass stage are not all that common in the pine family, but thick bark is fairly common. Okay, so one of the big questions here is, when and why did these traits evolve in the pine family? And as I mentioned earlier, did this happen in response to fire, or do they just happen to be adaptive to fire? So on the right side here is a phylogeny of the pine family. And I know there's a lot going on. We're not going to go through all the weeds on this, but I've got these bullet points off to the side, and we're going to kind of walk through that. And you can see where these numbers are on the phylogeny, starting right at 237 million years ago next to the A, and then work your way up towards the right. So the pine family goes back 237 million years ago. The Pinus clade, which all of our pine species, the genus Pinus, goes back 126 million years. The big split between subgenre Pinus and Strobus, about 89 million years ago. So with pine, thin bark was the ancestral state. But by about 126 million years ago, we start to see thick bark appear in pine. And then by about 89 million years ago, we start to see really thick bark and also serotiny. The grass stage, not until about 40 million years ago, and then resprouting capacity somewhere around 20 million years ago. So this is another figure from that same paper that I pulled this from. And what this shows is, going from the top to the bottom, it has reconstructed earth temperature, oxygen concentration, carbon dioxide concentration, inertinite, which is a fossilized charcoal, and then burn probability at the bottom. And there's two horizontal lines there. The thin horizontal line is the origin of the pine family, and then that band, that thicker horizontal line, is when all of these different fire-adapted traits started to, at least everything other than the grass stage. So really the thick bark is in that band. And so what we see if we look at within that band is we see that there's elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature. There is high oxygen at that period, and the burn probability and the fossilized charcoal are both pretty high, right? So that suggests, right, that these traits probably evolved in response to fire. So all those things are happening, and that's the same time that we see these traits derived in the family. Okay. So I've got one more little phylogeny to show you here. So the black lines here all represent the part of the pine family that are in fire-prone environments, and then you get into the lighter ones towards the top. Those are non-fire prone environments. So you can see that split between fire and non-fire prone is pretty much consistent with that split between those subgenre, Pinus and Strobus. But I kind of snipped that bottom part of the tree out, and you can see that all four of our southern pines are actually in that little group, right? So they're all fairly closely related, and they're all within that fire-prone environment. Okay, so this kind of summarizes all of the different characteristics that we just went through, right? So all of our southern pine species have evolved in this surface fire regime as opposed to a canopy fire regime, right? That's because they all have, they're all shedding branches, dead branches, self-pruning. None of them are serotinous. They all have thick bark, not just thick bark, but really thick bark. We start to get to differences when we get to the seedling stages and the adaptations that have occurred at the seedling stage. So the first one is the resprouting capacity that we saw in shortleaf, but we don't see in the others. And the other is in the grass stage, which we see in longleaf, and I kind of have that asterisk there, kind of see a quasi-grass stage in the South Florida slash. So again, the point is when they're mature, right, they all have these same traits of self-pruning and really thick bark that make them fairly tolerant of even high-intensity surface fires. Okay, so we've kind of gotten through that first part. And now, why do we care about loblolly? And before we talk just about loblolly, let's talk about how these different pines got their names, right? Shortleaf and longleaf are pretty easy to figure out how somebody named them, right? It's kind of like how a river gets the name Little River or Big River, right? So shortleaf are about 3 to 5 inches long, longleaf about 8 to 18 inches long, right? And I guess whoever, the folks that were referring to these things, they were left with the overlapping length of loblolly and slash and said, well, we can't really call one of them medium leaf pine or anything, so let's call them by something else. And so they went with the habitat associations, right? And so these are interesting. Some of you have probably heard some of these. So slash is a slang term I never grew up hearing. Maybe some of you have, but it refers to swampy ground with trees and bushes. So these are slash trees growing on the left at the Audubon Corkscrew Swamp. This is down in Naples, Florida. And then on the right, we have a nice stand of slash at the Okefenokee Swamp. Okay. So the other habitat association is loblolly. So you can see I snipped out something from Webster's Dictionary online, right? So the first definition of loblolly is a thick gruel. Okay? And then the second definition is a mire or a mud hole. So if you go back into the Old English, the first definition for this was a thick gruel, right? And so back in the early 1600s, as Europeans were coming over, they associated this thick gruel that they were being fed on the ships with the low country down in the Carolinas. And as a result of loblolly trees being there, that's how they got their name. Some of the biggest remaining loblollies that we have can be found in some of these loblolly areas. For example, the one in the center here is the champion loblolly, and that's down at the Congaree National Park outside of Columbia, South Carolina. If you haven't been down there, really interesting place to go see some of these towering loblollies mixed in with a bunch of swamp trees. You know, it's always hard to get a real good idea of what a tree looks like from just a diameter picture like that. So the figure on the right is a drawing that shows the entire tree there, right? So it's about a 15-foot circumference around that tree, and it's about 170 feet tall. So as I was kind of going through and doing the, trying to figure out the naming, the linguistics of some of this stuff, I did a deep dive, and I'll detour for just a second because I thought this stuff was kind of funny. The first appearance of loblolly in writing was in 1597, and it was used to refer to a surgeon's assistant. And so you can see here on the left side, that's the surgeon's assistant. That's the loblolly boy. And I guess, right, they got their name because they were, one of their main duties was serving this gruel, this loblolly, to the sick folks. So, and then in the early 1800s, by 1814, loblolly boy starts to appear in U.S. Navy regulations. So, and that help wanted ad on the right side there is actually, that's not period, that is fictitious. It came from a child labor webpage. You can see it's really selling it pretty hard about how great it would be to be a loblolly boy. Serving food to sick people, restraining patients during surgery, cleaning toilet utensils, cleaning surgical instruments, maybe at the same time, disposing of amputated limbs. They also had to deal with all the medicine and the herbs, so the loblolly boy was probably also the ship's drug dealer. Okay, so that's how we get our name loblolly, right? Why do we care about loblolly? So, you know, loblolly has been the darling of the forest industry for over 70 years, right? By chance, it kind of got selected as the one that foresters, the species that foresters wanted to get behind and put the inertia into to really develop as a production species. So it's the most widely planted tree species, not only in the South, but across the entire United States. And in the South, it accounts for well over half of the pine in the landscape. So these two figures to the left, some of you have probably seen before. This is in some shape or another. They've been modified quite a bit. But these are from Tom Fox, kind of looking at the history of pine productivity. And the figure on the top just shows over the past 70 years, it's not quite up to date, but since 1950, the increase in pine plantations in the South, right? And remember, most of this is loblolly. The bottom figure shows different tree improvement techniques, different silvicultural techniques to be able to increase pine productivity, right? And again, most of this is with loblolly. Most of the actual tree improvement and breeding programs have focused on loblolly, and most of the fertilization and herbicide programs that have increased productivity have also focused on loblolly. Okay, so it's very economically important, right? Very, very important species. And actually not just in the United States, but it's also a big producer down in Brazil now, right? Eucalyptus and loblolly pine are some of their biggest producers. So why do we burn loblolly? So, you know, this figure shows a pine stand with a, you know, pretty healthy understory component there, right? A bunch of sweet gum. And it's not necessarily just sweet gum, but I have a bunch of data on sweet gum, so that's kind of how we're going to talk about competition right now with loblolly stands. So as there's been some discussion already, and I think a lot of you already know, you know, these multi-stem shrubs can kind of persist through multiple fires in the understory. If you stop burning, they can start to get up into the mid-story to where you cannot get rid of them with fire, and you either need herbicide or mechanical control. And what are they doing? They're competing with the pine that we're trying to produce for water and other nutrients in the soil. And just to give you an idea of how pesky some of these competitors are, the picture on the right here is from an excavation that Paul Cormanick did years ago. And so those are all loblolly trees that you can see, and those are all interconnected root systems, right? So what you're dealing with here is not just a seedling, right? Not just a sweet gum seedling that's sitting there waiting for its time. You've got a superorganism, essentially, that is able to share resources between stems, both stored carbon and nutrients, in order to be able to grow quickly after a fire, right? So, that's another, I think we could argue that sweet gum is fairly well adapted to fire as well, but that's a conversation for a different day. Okay, so one of my mentors, Bob Mitchell, while he was at the University of Auburn back in the early 90s, did a study with loblolly pine seedlings and sweet gum seedlings and tried to look at the effects of competition from sweet gum on soil moisture and loblolly pine water potential, which is a measure of how water stressed it is. This figure on the left, we're not going to go through all of them, but that shows soil moisture. And what you see with the big divergence between lines there is that as you increase the amount of sweet gum, soil moisture goes down considerably. That's the big gap there, right? So lots of sweet gum, they're using water. The figure on the right is the water potential for loblolly pine seedlings. And you can see at the same time where the soil moisture really diverges, you start to see some dips. Basically, just look at the filled circle and the filled triangle. The filled circle is the control. The filled triangle is the high sweet gum density. And so what you see with higher sweet gum density is that the loblolly pines are becoming more water stressed, and they stay that way throughout most of the growing season. So I guess the take home here is that competition for water between some of these undesirable species like sweet gum and loblolly start pretty early, right? So that is why we're wanting to try to control these with fire. So the data here are from a hydrologic budget that I constructed with some other colleagues a few years back. This is going to be for closed canopy monoculture sweet gum and loblolly, right? So this just gives us an idea of how much water are these species using if we just grow them by themselves. The left axis here is daily transpiration, and the thin lines refer to the left axis. But I'm really just going to talk about the right axis, which is cumulative transpiration, the thick line. So here the blue is loblolly, the red is sweet gum. And so this is a 2-year period. And so you can see after 2 years, the blue line here, we're at about 1,000 millimeters of water for loblolly. So they're using about 500 millimeters of water per day. That's pretty good in a system where we have annual precipitation of somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 millimeters. Now, you look above that, we've got sweet gum using about 1,700 millimeters, or 850 millimeters per year. So sweet gum's using quite a bit more water, right? And sweet gum is actually using about 96% of the precipitation that makes it through the canopy to the soil, whereas loblolly is only using about 58% of that. So there's all kinds of other issues with ecosystem services, but just thinking in terms of water budgets, right? Sweet gum's using a lot more water. And if we look at the soil conditions here, so this is soil moisture storage during that same period. Red again is sweet gum, blue is loblolly, black is just bare unvegetated reference plots that we had. But just looking at the very center there, during the growing season, the main part of the growing season, you can see that soil moisture storage is going down quite a bit more with the red line with sweet gum than it is with loblolly, right? So sweet gum is extracting a lot more water out of the soil, right? And so these are the dynamics that are occurring while they're growing in monoculture stands. Who do you think is going to be a better competitor once we start mixing these stands, right? And I don't have that data to show you actually, but what I do have is the responses of these trees in terms of productivity. So, we were surprised to see how big those differences in water use were, but maybe we shouldn't have been so surprised because, so this experiment was originally a factorial forest productivity experiment where we had these controls. We irrigated some plots, we fertilized some plots, and then we irrigated and fertilized some plots. That's what that CIF is at the bottom. And if you look at loblolly pine, you can see that if we irrigate, we don't really get any production gains over the control. And as a matter of fact, if we irrigate on top of fertilizing, we don't really get any gains above just fertilizing. But if we look at sweet gum, we can see that they're taking a lot of water, they're using additional water from irrigation to produce a lot more biomass. And if we add that in addition to fertilizer, they're responding quite a bit, right? So again, no real data from interplanted stands at this point, but most of the data that we've collected and that's out there suggests that sweet gum should be a really good competitor for resources and outcompete loblolly, right? And so that's why it's important to control. And our options for doing that, prescribed fire is the most efficient, effective way to do that in a lot of stands, unless you want to get very intensive and start using a lot of herbicide. Okay, so like I said, I'm down at the Savannah River Ecology Lab. So this is actually, I'm a University of Georgia employee who actually goes to work every day in South Carolina. You can see here at the top left is Augusta, Georgia. You can see as you go down from Augusta, you can kind of see the Savannah River corridor there. And then that big green area that looks like a national forest is the Savannah River site. It looks mostly forested, and you can see kind of in the center a little bit of industrial stuff, right? So the U.S. Forest Service, this is a Department of Energy facility. The U.S. Forest Service has been managing this land since the 1950s, and they do a lot of prescribed burns, about 20,000 acres of prescribed burning every year. Most of this, when they took this land over in the 50s, most of it was old field agriculture, and they did a lot of replanting. They replanted loblolly and they replanted longleaf. So one of my colleagues over there, Chris Hobson, helped put this together because I said, hey, I'd like to know, how much loblolly do you guys burn every year, and where is it? So like I said, about 20,000 acres a year they're burning. So I guess for reference, that site is about 80,000 hectares, 200,000 acres, right? So they're burning about, over a 10-year period, they're burning about 200,000 acres. 76,000 acres of that is loblolly stands. The figure on the right shows all of those colors are loblolly stands that are being burned at different fire intervals. The boxes that don't show any color are also loblolly stands that don't receive fire. Now, if you remember that image I showed you before, that's pretty close to where all that industrial stuff is, right? And so that deals with, they don't burn not because burning's not a good tool for them. It's just not a good tool in those situations because of the industrial landscape that they have around them. And then if you look to the north of this site and to the east of that site, all of that white is primarily longleaf acreage. So the bottom figure there, the actual annual percentage of total loblolly that they're burning in a year isn't really all that high. It never really gets above 35%. But again, remember, a bunch of it's never burned at all because it's around industrial areas. So they do burn loblolly quite a bit, and they don't have any issues with it. They do burn it differently than they burn longleaf, right? And that goes back to those seedling strategies. Basically, they're not putting fire into a loblolly stand until it's about 15 years old, right? If you're managing a longleaf stand, you're probably not managing just an even age stand. It might be an uneven age stand. And because of the grass stage and the resilience of that, they don't really have a problem burning those stands just a few years after natural regeneration pops in. Okay, So I think that's one of the big differences here, right, is that on public lands, prescribed fire is really efficiently applied to be able to meet the objectives of controlling competing competition. I spoke with another colleague, Chip Miller of Jordan Lumber, earlier this week, and asked him a little bit about their procedures, right? So they're an industrial forestry company. And they do burn some stands, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But first I'm going to tell you about most of their loblolly stands, which they do not burn. They put fertilizer down. They look at any possibility of scorch is going against their investment into trying to increase leaf area and productivity, right? So we've got a lot of production loblolly systems where fire could be applied, but the intensity of silviculture is so high and the investments are so high that they look at it as a net loss rather than a potential efficient way of managing. Okay. So I think that's part of what perpetuates this difference between the people that put fire on the ground and kind of understand how loblolly is well suited for prescribed fire versus those who get a little sweaty when you talk about it. Okay, so that's the why do we burn. What more do we need to know? What are the other questions? I mean, really, with prescribed fire and fire effects, there's actually a lot of questions, not just for loblolly, for all kinds of species, right? So a lot of it comes down to shortcomings and problems with what we know or what we think we know about prescribed fire effects. So in general, with loblolly, there's been a lack of research, and a lot of it's mostly anecdotal. Some of it is, and this is the case not just with loblolly, but with most prescribed fire studies, a lot of it is post hoc, right? We're not actually measuring the process of fire behavior. We're usually just measuring the outcomes, right? And I liken that to doing a kind of a drought study without measuring precipitation or soil moisture, right? So we're trying to say something about what happened without measuring the magnitude of what happened. And then finally, I think one of the biggest issues here is that we often confound stand characteristics with species. And what I mean by that is, if we think about comparing species of longleaf and loblolly, their typical stand characteristics are very different. Longleaf typically has much lower densities, much more open canopy than a loblolly plantation. And thermal energy moves differently through those types of systems, right? It generally takes the path of least resistance. If you have gaps, those act as chimneys, and thermal energy moves through there. If you have a closed canopy, you don't have anywhere for the thermal energy to move except up into the foliage, and then you might see some scorching. You might see a lot of scorching. So I think those confounding effects are important to consider when comparing species. And I mentioned Jordan Lumber did burn one type of stand. The type of stand that they burn is what they refer to as old growth loblolly, and they burn it on a 4-year interval, right? And they do that because that stand structure is a lot more like what we consider like a longleaf structure. It's not a super closed canopy. They don't have any issues with scorching and any concerns there. Okay, so on the topic of scorching, right? That is the thing that we're usually not seeing trees getting consumed in prescribed fires. It's usually the scorching that we're concerned with. And these are some data from a study where we experimentally scorched up to about 90% of longleaf canopies. And longleaf recovers really well. So this figure that I have here shows canopy photosynthesis on the y-axis, and this is as a percent of the control. We measured this through sap flow, through whole tree water use. And so what you see right there on the left side, as soon as we scorched these trees, canopy photosynthesis went down to about 20% that of the control. However, after about 30 days, canopy photosynthesis was back to about 80% of the controls. So there was certainly a reduction in photosynthesis for a month period, and that, I'm not going to argue that that's not inconsequential, but this is also controlling that system and removing all the other competitors that are going to be competing for water with these species. And you also have to remember, we're usually not putting prescribed fire out and having 90% canopy scorching, right? That's not usually our objective. This is a severe example, right? Under most scorching conditions, right, we can control our firing patterns to kind of, deal with the type of scorch to minimize scorch. So we shouldn't expect to see that kind of stuff. But we don't really have any data on loblolly, or really slash for that matter, and how different it could be than that species. We have a pretty good idea of what the mechanism of recovery is for longleaf. So this is from another one of my studies. This is starch concentrations. So this is the pool of carbon reserves in a tree that can be used to build new tissue, right? So if we're thinking about a deciduous tree, this is the pool that helps build new leaves every spring. For some of our southern pines, this is the pool that can help refoliate after scorching. So there, you can see that there's October and March. March is generally our highest concentrations of starch in the root system. And so I've circled the root system. And so what we have there is the white is loblolly, and then the gray is slash, and then the black is longleaf. And so you can see not much of a difference between slash and loblolly. A lot higher storage reserves, starch reserves in longleaf. So there may really be a difference in their ability to be able to refoliate canopies, but we haven't done the same types of experiments with either slash or loblolly that we've done with longleaf. And quite honestly, if you do the calculations, there's a lot more starch there that a tree needs to rebuild the canopy, probably two or three times. So even those loblolly and slash concentrations should be sufficient. Okay, so what we do know from the literature is that mortality of loblolly following moderate scorch is fairly negligible. And even with higher scorch, it's usually only the stressed or suppressed trees in dense stands that tend to exhibit any mortality. And we don't really see any impacts of scorch on growth for trees with moderate or low levels of scorch, right? So that's what we have from the literature. Granted, it's not overwhelming, but I think what we do really need to do is do side-by-side comparisons of some of these species and measure fire intensity, like I said, control for stand structure, which I indicated kind of confounds our inference about these things, and also assess a variety of different physiological and growth responses. Okay, so what are the take-home messages here? A couple of things that the only things I really want you to walk away from here, other than thinking about how you want your kid to grow up to be a loblolly boy, is all southern pines are fire pines, right? They're all fire pines. They just have different strategies as seedlings, right? And that it's not that that's not important. It is really important, right? You can't continually put a fire through a stand and really hope to get, every couple of years and really hope to get a good loblolly into the mid-story, right? Because its strategy is different. It doesn't persist through a lot of fires, right? You need to have some time to get those in. Prescribed fire is really important for reducing competition, right? A lot of hardwoods, pines in general have been relegated to, subpar sites because they get outcompeted in better sites by the broadleaf species, right? So prescribed fire is really important, but the implementation does need to differ between loblolly and longleaf, right? Especially if we're thinking about even-age silviculture and how seedlings can deal with fire. Like I said, 15 years is what they do at the Savannah River site for loblolly, not until 15 years. So there's a lot we still need to know about mechanistic fire effects, right? That's a lot of what we're trying to do, is trying to really understand how do we measure the process that we want to talk about and then link that with the outcomes, right? Because only by doing that are we going to be able to really make good mechanistic predictions about the processes we want to understand. And only then can we give information to land managers to say, under these conditions, this is what you should expect based on the objectives that you're after. And I guess the biggest thing, is going through this and thinking about this is, I don't think it's the species. I think it's the silviculture, right? I think that's where some of these ideas between whether longleaf is a fire pine, loblolly not so much. We see on public lands a lot of loblolly being burned every year, and they're being managed very, very well. So it's a difference between public and private lands. It's a difference in the intensity of the silviculture, and a big difference in the structure of the stands, whether they're open or whether they're closed, whether you should expect a lot of scorching or not. Okay, so hopefully you guys agree that loblolly is a fire pine after all of that. If not, you can come and talk to me later, and we can chat about it. But I showed a number of projects that I've been involved in, and I can't really give due credit to everybody who's been involved in that stuff, so I just want to give a broad thanks to everybody who helped with that stuff. I do need to acknowledge some funders that supported that. USDA NIFA has supported some of that work. The scorching study was supported while I was a PhD student by the Jones Center at Itchaway. The Forest Service has supported some of that work. And currently, the work that Joe O'Brien and I are doing now, looking at mechanistic fire effects, is supported by the Department of Defense CERTIP project. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you guys a little bit about pine trees and fire pines, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks. Yeah, Lindsay.
One question. If you also factor in potential pine bark beetles and defoliators into that scenario of crown scorch, there could be mitigating factors there, especially with wildfire. What do you think about that?
So I think that's a great question. That's something we've worked on a little bit in the past. We have a paper in review right now where we've made some arguments about this. So I'm going to answer that by telling a little bit of a story. A couple of years ago, there were some drought conditions, and there were concerns about prescribed fire maybe encouraging or making the pine stands more susceptible to bark beetle attack, right? And while typically you don't want to burn outside of a prescription, but you also don't want to not burn in conditions where your prescription fits and not meet the objectives that you're trying to. And so in that case, I think by burning and making sure you're getting rid of that competition and making sure that those trees aren't stressed should help them be more more adept at being able to tolerate those bark beetles. So does that help get at your question? Okay.
So, I'm in Story County, and supposedly, when I bought these trees, Warehouse told me that we should have a mature tree at 20 years for loblolly, maybe 25 years for much. And that would be, the middle we got right here, that's what we're going to take to cut. So if we burn at 15 years, how do we control those competing, those competing species for 15 years?
Oh, in between, if you're not putting fire on the ground? Well, so a lot of that probably comes down to, I would argue, fire is one of the tools we have in silviculture. So of course you would still want to use fire as a site prep, right? And that's going to help. Good site prep can get a long way in making sure you don't have a lot of competition. But kind of have to look at something like herbicide. Initially, good site prep with either fire or both fire and herbicide, and then putting some herbicide on the ground too.
I did both of those when I planted, but so once you plant, just let it go for 15 years.
That
burn in, is what it's saying.
yeah. So that you know, I don't think there's not a one size fits all with all, right? I mean, it depends on the site, and I'm a physiologist. I'm not a silviculturist when it comes down to it, but you know, I do know, depending on your soils, there's definitely certain, you know, different tools that you can use. Some people don't want to use a lot of herbicide for different reasons, right? You know, fertilizing. I mean, you know, Weyerhaeuser is an industrial forester, right? Weyerhaeuser owns 9 million acres of loblolly pine. They are the largest single loblolly pine owner in the world. They use a lot of fertilizer. That's, you know, and when they're thinking of you getting your trees harvested in a very short period, they're thinking of intensive management.
Dr. Aubrey.
All right, thank you.